All right, thank you for joining us, everybody. This is the panel on how to stop the slide into authoritarianism of Hungary, Turkey, Russia, China, and India. So wish us luck. That's a lot of countries to stop the slide in. And we can add a couple to that list too, including apparently the United States and Israel and many other countries. Yesterday I was moderating a panel on divisions of power and what happens if you get rid of the judges or you don't listen to the judges, and Trump was in the middle of not listening to judges. And this morning we talk about authoritarianism. First thing I saw when I woke up was Steve Bannon is saying how Trump might run for a third term. So I think they're trying to help me out by delivering news about whatever topic I'm moderating on in America. But here, boy, do we have some experts. So we're going to do a couple of keynotes here and then get into the whole panel discussion. Let me start with András Baka. He's the former president of the Supreme Court of Hungary, and he could certainly speak to the authoritarianism slide there.
Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to talk about this topic. Thank you. And I think this is a kind of continuation of the yesterday topic that we had, how to protect the division of powers. It's exactly the same topic. Right now we have how to stop the slide into authoritarianism, and the countries concerned. And I could list a great number of countries, including the U.S. Today, and not just those which is mentioned in this summary of the program. It's not doesn't simply affect Hungary, Turkey, Russia, China, India. It affects other countries as well. Probably even better than some of those which has been mentioned. Of course, first I would like to mention what are the factors behind the slide into authoritarianism. Of course, sometimes the factors are very complex. I could mention, historically speaking, the lack of democratic traditions in certain countries, and it makes easier to slide into authoritarianism because these countries experienced democratic values for a relatively short period of time. Others are having more established democracies, and nevertheless, leaders in these countries are always begin to challenging the checks and balancing. They are always dismantling the independence of judiciary, undermining the press, and curbing the freedom of expression. And over time, it leads to democratic erosion and the erosion of democratic safeguards. This is also a common factors. They are manipulating on national security concerns. Keep telling the people that the national security is in danger. It is typically the Hungarian situation. National security is in danger, and to survive, they have to enact special restrictive measures like suppression of opposition, free media, civil liberties, including impose restrictions to civil liberties. It's also a common feature that they are weakening the institutions. They keep weakening the institutions, like parliaments, the independent courts. Like yesterday, we talked about how they attack the courts, and this is quite a common phenomenon. It happened in Hungary. It's happening in the U.S. which has been until now an established democracy. And right now we are experiencing something absolutely new, never experienced it in the United States, or rarely experienced in the United States. And also the media, attack on the media, attack on the academic freedom, and these are the factors and the phenomena behind the scenes. I could mention a couple of measures what happened in Hungary. In Hungary, they took over the media within a very short time. Within a very short period of time, it means that within half a year, they have 90% of the whole media, public televisions, newspapers, county newspapers. Everything is in the hand of the government right now, and this is a powerful means to influence the public opinion. It's a powerful means to influence the way of thinking of people who cannot afford to get information from the very different sources. They can have 4 or 5 television channels ruled by the government. They are living in the countryside. They can't afford to buy access to different sources. Of course, the second was the judiciary. Yesterday I also mentioned that the government changed, by 2/3 majority, they changed the constitution, and they enacted rules which led to oppress, or at least undermine the authority of the judiciary. Probably the most important or the most shocking experience was that they reduced the retirement age of the judges. We had a tradition of having a retired age of 70 years for the judges, and this was, as I mentioned yesterday, this is about the average in Europe, and average retirement age of the judges. And within 8 days, they reduced it to 62, from 70 to 62. And the judges, 1/10 of the judiciary was dismissed. I think, they immediately replaced the dismissed judges, filled up the vacant positions, and it was a shocking experience. The Hungarian judiciary was never experienced anything like that. I mean, Hungarian judiciary was, even during the last decade of the socialist regime, it was relatively free. The judges could do what they could. I mean, with certain exceptions. I mean, with certain high-level, very political cases, but otherwise the Hungarian judiciary was all right, even during the last decade of the communist regime. Of course, I already mentioned the media control, which is a shocking experience. Also, I would like to mention the Orbán regime is starting systematically attack the NGOs, the civil society, the non-governmental organizations, and it's going on right now. What's happening in Hungary is a massive attack on civil society, massive attack on non-governmental organizations, Amnesty International, and others. So it is what, and also they introduced constitutional reforms. They changed also the electoral system. Originally, they got 2/3 majority by getting 52.7% of the votes. They got 2/3 majority by that. That was the original. And right now they have 46% of the votes, and they still have the 2/3 majority. So they are changing the electoral law, and the next coming elections is going to come next year, in a year time. And of course, we don't know whether we would have elections first. I mean, just imagine that a European Union member state is discussing whether we are going to have elections. It's outrageous. And also even if we would have elections, probably we will have elections, but nevertheless, how they are going to change the rules concerning the elections. So there are a lot of question marks about the future. Right now we have an oppositional party, a party in opposition, which is quite promising. It led the polls by 9% ahead of the ruling party right now. But we are wondering whether this will be enough or not under the circumstances where everything is in the hand of the government. The media, the money, the resources to influence the public, the 2/3 majority to change everything possible. And of course, they have the friendship of Mr. Putin too, and they have a friendship of Trump. So I don't know what's going to happen. Well, of course, the question is what we can do, and the general measures, how we can handle these situations in the different countries. I think there are plenty of means. I can mention the sanctions. The sanctions. Hungary is heavily sanctioned by the EU, so they don't let the government to get the resources, and this is a significant amount of money. And in a small country like Hungary, it should work, but it doesn't. It doesn't. The government gets the resources, the same resources from the market, and they don't rely heavily or exclusively to the EU, the more cheaper EU resources. And also there are diplomatic sanctions. There are a very, very broad range of different sanctions. There are political sanctions. There are diplomatic sanctions, but I think these are simply not enough to handle the situation. And of course, we will hear very soon that what would require to change the regime in Russia, but the sanctions alone is not enough. It's one of the elements of the different sanctions. Of course, I could go on, but I rather stop here and let have a discussion, a broader discussion.
All right, thank you. We're going to come back to some of those issues on how to stop the slide. And Hungary is a really interesting case. In America, Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, a lot of the right-wing media and political figures are constantly praising Orban as the right way to do things and the blueprint. And what did they do? You know, to your point, first thing Trump did when he got into office was he sued a whole bunch of media companies to try to quiet them and take money from them and intimidate them. That was number one on your list, go after the media. Number two, he said he might not follow court orders. So there is a blueprint. It's certainly, when you talk about taking a democratic country and sliding it into authoritarianism, unfortunately, Hungary is the model that people talk about. And what's amazing about the right wing in America is they brag about it. They're like, yeah, we love what Hungary did, and so we'd love to do that. I'm like, you're actually confessing, but our media has challenges. Okay, now, a little further into authoritarianism, the slide being significant in Russia. We're really lucky here to have Vladimir Kara-Murza. He is the opposition leader in Russia. He's been poisoned by Putin, so that's pretty authoritarian. Put in a Siberian prison, 13 different prisons, and it doesn't get much more authoritarian than that. So, love to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone who's here this morning. And my thanks go to the Cinema for Peace Foundation for bringing us here together for this World Forum. Well, talking about blueprints and textbook examples of how to turn democracies into authoritarian regimes, I think Vladimir Putin's experience will go down in history books as one of those blueprints that dictators have used to do this. Exactly 25 years ago this month, actually, Vladimir Putin first became president of Russia. He won the presidential election on the 26th of March of year 2000. There were many subsequent media investigations questioning the legitimacy of his first round win. The official results was that he got 52%, which is just enough to avoid a runoff. The communist leader Gennady Zyuganov was second, and liberal candidate Grigory Yavlinsky, who actually warned of a coming authoritarianism in his campaign ads. I remember very well, I had just turned 18 at the time. This was my first presidential election I voted in, and the last one, because since then we haven't had a free and fair election in Russia even once. I remember Yavlinsky's campaign ads showing political prisoners in a future gulag, showing Russian soldiers engaged in a myriad of endless bloody wars. And at the time, people thought, he's an alarmist, this is never going to happen. Of course, that's the reality we're living in today. He came in third place. And as I said, there were many media investigations in the spring of 2000 showing significant evidence of ballot stuffing and fraud in various regions of Russia, and questioning the fact that Putin actually did get over 50% of the vote. But be that as it may, this was the last election held under Vladimir Putin's rule that was assessed by international observers from the Council of Europe and the OSCE as at least generally conforming to democratic standards and standards of free and fair electoral competition. Not a single election since has come even close. And we do, of course, have a two-term limit on the presidency in our constitution, as do many countries. But Vladimir Putin has now been in power for 25 years running. We have a whole generation of people in my country who have grown up not knowing any other political reality, not once seeing a competitive election, not knowing what independent television is, not knowing what the rule of law and independent judiciary is, not knowing what a real parliament looks like. And when Putin set out to do this, to transform a very imperfect democracy that we had in the 90s to the perfect authoritarian state at first, and now I would argue it's actually more totalitarian than authoritarian. I think we crossed that line quite a while ago. He did it very much in a way that showed Putin to be a good student of Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, who, when he came to power and consolidated his absolute power in Italy in the early 1920s, he said that he was going to do this in a matter of, and I quote, plucking the chicken feather by feather to lessen the squawking. End of quote. That's the phrase Mussolini used, and that's exactly how he went about it, meaning don't try to do it all at once. Don't try to do it in a coup. I mean, we've known many examples in the 20th century with authoritarian or dictatorial regimes coming in a coup, like the communists in Cuba or Pinochet in Chile and so on. That's not the way things happen in Russia. And Putin heeded Mussolini's advice, and he indeed started plucking the chicken feather by feather. The first feather, as with many of these dictatorial examples, was, of course, the independent media. That's the first thing that dictators go after. We have a saying in Russian, a proverb, «Кто нас обидит, 3 дней не проживет». Those who will offend us will not survive 3 days. And almost literally, in a direct sort of sense of this proverb, on the 4th day of his inauguration as president of Russia in May of 2000, Mr. Putin sent armed operatives from the FSB, the General Prosecutor's Service, and the Tax Police to raid the offices of Media Most, which was the largest private media holding in Russia, and the parent company of NTV, which was the most popular, the most successful, privately owned independent television channel. NTV had existed since the early 1990s. The biggest accomplishment of the Yeltsin era in the post-Soviet history of Russia was, I would argue, the independence of the media. It was real. It was accessible to people. NTV was the most watched television channel in Russia. And it had a very independent, a fiercely independent, I would say, editorial policy. For example, in the mid-90s, NTV brought the uncensored, horrific reality of the first Chechen war to millions of households around Russia. And that was the major reason that that war was very unpopular with my fellow citizens, because people actually knew the truth about it, unlike what's happening today. And NTV was very critical of the authorities in general and the president personally. When it was Yeltsin, his point of principle was not to touch the media. Mr. Putin, of course, was very different because of his KGB background partly, but also I think just because of the personality issues that he clearly has. And two things that NTV did during that election campaign in 2000 that really got the Kremlin angry. Number one was there was this flagship satirical program called Kukli, sort of like the Spitting Image in Britain back in the 80s and 90s, where you had major political figures represented by puppets. Kukli means literally puppets. And they would usually base their episodes on some works of literature that people knew, and sort of played around with people from that book being represented by political figures. And during the election campaign, this was late January of 2000, Kukli aired an episode based on a 19th century German novel by writer Ernst Hoffmann called Little Sachs, featuring an ugly dwarf who, thanks to a magic dust from a fairy, was suddenly not transformed, but everybody around him suddenly thought that he's handsome, that he's intelligent, that this is the best person in the world. But actually, this was just an ugly dwarf, and you can guess who the ugly dwarf was portrayed by. Vladimir Putin was furious. That same evening, he was reported to have said that Gusinski's finished, Gusinski being the major shareholder of that independent TV company. And even worse, just literally a couple of days before the presidential election, NTV aired a live investigative show strongly suggesting that the mysterious bombings of residential buildings in the autumn of 1999 that were blamed by the government on Chechen terrorists and that served as a pretext for the launch of the second war in Chechnya were actually staged by the Russian security services, the FSB. This was aired live on Russian national television. And of course, that was not something the Kremlin was ready to forgive. So, as I mentioned, on the fourth day after his inauguration, Mr. Putin sent armed operatives to raid the offices of Media Most, the NTV parent company. They employed the full power of the state, including leaning heavily on the judiciary. And TV actually at the beginning won some of the court cases against the government because at that time we still had at least a more or less independent judiciary. So that was in effect a dual track process, at the same time silencing independent media and bringing the judiciary to heel. NTV managed to survive about a year in its head-to-head battle with the Russian state. On early dawn on Easter Saturday in April 2001, the studios of NTV in Moscow's Ostankino television center were forcibly taken over by guards from Gazprom, the energy giant, the state gas company, which was declared to be the new owner. They installed a new management, and within a very short time, NTV became one of the many government propaganda mouthpieces, as all nationwide media in Russia are today. As I mentioned earlier, this was a gradual process of dismantling democracy in Russia, of that slide to authoritarianism, to use the title of our discussion this morning. And it would be difficult impossible, I would say, to pinpoint the exact day or month when Russia ceased being a democracy and became an authoritarian regime. But we can pinpoint the year, and that year was 2003. That was a turning point year in many ways, but there were three major things that happened in that one year that sealed and made that slide into authoritarianism complete. The first thing happened in June of 2003, June 22nd to be precise, when the Putin government shut off the broadcasting of the last independent nationwide TV channel. There had been several. In fact, at the moment when Putin came to power, most of Russia's television channels were not controlled by the government. They were privately owned by different owners. So there was a genuine pluralism of the media. When Putin came to power, Russia had a federal structure where you had governors of the regions being elected and legislatures of the regions being elected and having significant authority. Of course, we had a real parliament in Russia with genuine opposition, with real debates, a parliament that was a pluralistic body, as a parliament is supposed to be. And so 2003 saw an end to all of that. As I mentioned, in June of 2003, Putin's government pulled the plug on TVS, the last independently owned TV channel, bringing a complete state monopoly over all of Russia's airwaves. So ever since then, for more than 20 years now, Russian television has been completely monopolized by the state and has served as a mouthpiece for the regime propaganda. Then in October 2003, Vladimir Putin arrested the richest man in Russia, an oil tycoon by the name of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the owner of the most successful private oil company in Russia, Yukos. He was the richest man in Russia. He was the richest man in Europe under the age of 40 at the time. And he allowed himself to behave in a way that, to put it mildly, did not please the authorities in the Kremlin. He would fund opposition parties and candidates in elections. He would support civil society groups. He would fund education projects, especially in the regions. He had a special program of spreading the internet, high-speed internet, to provincial schools. And he behaved in a demonstratively independent way from the government, thus giving example also to many other business leaders in Russia. And one thing that I think is absolutely necessary for civil society and the opposition to function is to actually be able to count on independent sources of support, because once everything is monopolized by the government, well, that's it. And of course, that's something Mr. Putin did not want to allow. So one very early morning in October of 2003, as Khodorkovsky's private jet landed for refueling in Novosibirsk airport, it was raided by the FSB. He was arrested, handcuffed, put on a different plane, brought back to Moscow. And the next day, he was paraded in the Basmanny district court in Moscow that was deciding on his arrest, literally sitting in a metal cage. The richest man in Russia, a billionaire, sitting in a metal cage, shown on national TV. And this was a very strong signal to the rest of Russia's business community. If you behave like him, that's where you're going to end up. And they certainly heeded the message. Khodorkovsky would spend more than 10 years in Putin's prisons before being released just before the Sochi Olympics in December of 2013, largely at the behest of the German government. And he was actually, when he was flown from prison to Berlin in December of 2013, he was actually brought and stayed for a couple of weeks at this very hotel, the Adlon. I just realized this. That was the first place he went off to prison. So that was the second thing. The third and final thing that marked that turning point from democracy to dictatorship in Russia was the parliamentary election held in December 2003, which I remember very well because I was a candidate for the Russian parliament in that election. So I had an inside view, as it were, a front seat view. And that election was famously, or perhaps infamously, described by David Atkinson, who was the head of the Council of Europe Observer Mission at that election in Russia, as, and I quote, free, but certainly not fair, end of quote. Free in a sense that people like myself could still participate, as candidates to be on the ballot. Now, this is unthinkable today. But it was not fair in a sense that the results were predetermined, and the total government dominance of the media and the total government control over the entire bureaucratic machinery, including electoral commissions that made sure that the results were the correct ones. The results were decided well ahead of time, and that election resulted in the Russian parliament becoming devoid of any real opposition. The two large pro-democracy parties that provided real opposition to the Putin regime, one led by Boris Nemtsov and the other led by Grigory Yavlinsky, were both thrown out of the Russian parliament in that very election. And the State Duma was turned essentially into a rubber stamp, the way the Supreme Soviet of the USSR functioned back in the communist times. And that is how it remained today. I think one of the quotes that will go down in future history books describing the Putin regime was a phrase uttered by the speaker of that parliament elected in 2003, Boris Gryzlov, Putin's colleague in the United Russia Party, who said, and I quote, "Parliament is not a place for discussion," end of quote. I think that's going to go down as a definition. And so by early 2004, that slide into authoritarianism was pretty much finished. And then Putin just did a couple of more things, like abolishing gubernatorial elections, and then passing all these laws on so-called foreign agents and so-called undesirable organizations, which the Russian government can declare any NGO it doesn't like to be undesirable and put people in prison for cooperating with it. And if you look If you go to the website of the Russian Justice Ministry and you look at the list of so-called undesirable organizations, you will see the best of the best in the human rights world, the NGOs defending press freedom, constitutional freedoms, electoral freedoms, and so on. These are all considered undesirable organizations by the Putin regime. When I said at the beginning that I think authoritarian no longer applies because the Putin regime is fully totalitarian, I think that final red line was crossed by the regime in February of 2015, when Boris Nemtsov, the leader of the Russian opposition, the most prominent, the most powerful, the most effective political opponent of Vladimir Putin, the former deputy prime minister of Russia, was gunned down, assassinated on a bridge, literally in front of the Kremlin in Moscow, a couple of hundred meters from the Kremlin wall. And needless to say, the organizers and masterminds were completely shielded and protected by the Russian state. Only the lowest levels perpetrators were found. Everything else was completely sealed. For obvious reasons, one does not investigate oneself. And, if you can murder the main opposition leader in the middle of your capital city and completely get away with it, there's nothing else to talk about. And so today it is a totalitarian regime in which any opposition to Putin or any opposition certainly to his war in Ukraine leads you directly to prison, where parliament is a rubber stamp, where any NGO working on human rights is declared an undesirable organization, where we have a record number today of political prisoners. The latest figure is, I looked it up this morning before coming to this panel. This is from OVD Info, one of Russia's leading human rights groups. According to publicly available figures, we have today 1,524 political prisoners in Russia, which is more than the whole of the USSR, so that's 15 different countries put together, had in the mid-1980s. And totalitarianism is the only way to describe that system. But we got there gradually. And talking about the blueprint, as the moderator did, I think it's very important also as a warning to other countries that may only be making its first steps on this road. And it's completely astonishing that we're even mentioning the United States, but we have to, because, looking at what's going on there, my good friend Peter Baker, who was the Washington Post bureau chief in Moscow in the early 2000s when Putin was consolidating his power, he recently wrote a big piece for the New York Times saying how eerily reminiscent to him is what's happening in America now with what he experienced 25 years ago when he was posted in Moscow and seeing Putin's first steps on this road. As President Ronald Reagan once said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. So I think the main important lesson, the most important point, the most important warning is that people should not wait to do something about this, because by the time Russian society woke up and by the time really big protests began against Putin's rule, this was the winter of 2011, 2012, so more than a decade into Putin's rule, it was already too late, because the regime had consolidated its power so much that these protests were relatively easily put down. So the main lesson is don't wait, start resisting this from the very beginning.
Okay, I actually want to ask about that because that's obviously enormously pertinent today, all across the world. I'm in media. There's two relevant reasons that I tell you that. Number one, it's funny that I'm in media and I keep forgetting to introduce myself every time on a panel. Okay, I'm Cenk Uyghur, by the way. I'm the host of the Young Turks. We're the largest online progressive network, really online network, period, in America. But I also want to introduce now Gulchehra Hoja. She's a Uyghur American. She's a journalist and founder of Radio Free Asia. And there's Yavuz Aydin, who's a Turkish judge living in exile. So we're going to bring them into the conversation in a minute. But I wanted to actually first follow up with you, Vladimir. So for those of us who are in the early days and who would like to prevent what happened in Russia, if I've got a question for you on knowing what you know now, what would you have counseled the Russian opposition to do as soon as Putin got into office back in 2003?
Right. Well,
or 2000.
I was fortunate to have worked with Boris Nemtsov for many, many years. I actually began to work with him in November of 1999, so about a month before Putin came to power. So this all happened literally in front of my eyes. And Nemtsov was one of the people who saw this very early on and who tried to do all he could to stop this from coming. But so many others were complacent and saying, you're fear-mongering, you're alarmist, it's going to be okay. One of the very early warning signs, by the way, which sometimes it's not a specific practical action, but a symbol that can give you a sense of where things are going, especially in Russia. Russia is a country of symbols. And one of the first things Putin did when he came to power 25 years ago was he reinstated Joseph Stalin's national anthem, the former national anthem of the Soviet Union, as the national anthem of the Russian Federation. And to anybody who knows Russian history, that signal was the most potent one he could have chosen to signify the direction of his rule. And Boris Nemtsov was very vocal against that, and so was Grigory Yavlinsky, the head of the other pro-democracy party in the Russian parliament. And you can go and read those Hansard transcripts from the Duma debates in 2000, 2001, 2002. People did warn about it, but unfortunately society wasn't really paying attention. Putin was really fortunate. He was really lucky, as were some other autocrats, in just the accidental timing, the coincidence of his coming to power. It was a time when oil prices suddenly started to rise. And of course, the oil revenues are the major source of Russian government budget. And under President Yeltsin, for example, in 1998, in the summer of 98, when the Russian government was forced to default on its obligations and devalue the currency, it was a big financial crisis, the price of oil was $9 per barrel. 9. In the first 3 years of Putin's rule, it rose up to 67. By 2008, it was 168. Can you imagine the figures?
Wow.
And there was a tangible rise in the standards of living, which is not difficult when you have such a big rise of revenue. And especially in the big cities in Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg, some of the others, the standard of living basically approached that of other Central and Eastern European countries. And for the first time in a long time, there was a tangible rise in prosperity for a lot of people. And so, as would happen in any other country, the satisfaction with the state of the economy translated into, if not support, then passive acquiescence of the incumbent, and certainly a disinterest in politics. This was the biggest, I would say, sort of sign of the state of Russian society in the early 2000s. It was a disinterest in politics. People did not want to talk about it, didn't want to hear about it. We don't care about this. We're going to take care of ourselves, of our families. People were suddenly able to afford new appliances, new cars, holidays abroad, and people were enjoying this sort of newfound prosperity and not paying attention to politics. And that was a perfect timing for Putin to do everything that he did at that time. And as we discussed earlier, by the time Russian society did wake up and the big mass anti-Putin protests broke out in the winter of 2011, 2012, it was already too late because the regime by then had been really consolidated. But I would also have another answer to your question, Cenk, which is no less important. Because of course, all of these countries that we're discussing, Hungary, Turkey, Russia, they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist as part of the international community. Especially Russia was very much integrated into the international community when Putin came to power. We were in the G8, we were in the Council of Europe, with all the obligations subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. I mean, there are all these structures that were there that were also supposed to serve as a check. But of course, they only serve as a check if there's political will on the side of that international system to become that check. And we saw, frankly, the very opposite from many Western leaders when Putin came to power. We all remember, one American president, George W. Bush, looking into Putin's eyes and seeing his soul. We all remember another American president, Barack Obama, pushing a reset button with Putin. For years and years and years, Western leaders on both sides of the Atlantic engaged in a policy of enabling and appeasement with regard to Vladimir Putin. They purposefully turned a blind eye on all the domestic authoritarian abuses in Russia in hope of reaching some sort of accommodation, a modus operandi with Vladimir Putin on the international stage. Except it never works. Because, well, first of all, I would argue that for the leaders of democratic nations, such a policy is immoral because, these are the countries that claim to stand on these values of the rule of law, respect for human rights and democracy. And suddenly they were okay with Putin destroying all these concepts in Russia if they continue to trade oil and gas with him. So it's frankly very cynical and very immoral, but also very impractical. Because as we know from the modern history of Russia, repression at home and aggression abroad always go together in our country. They're always two sides of the same coin because a regime, a government that does not respect the rights of its own citizens is not going to respect the borders of its neighbors. And so very naturally, this consolidation of authoritarian power, first domestically by Putin, led eventually to outward aggression, including the largest military conflict on European soil since the Second World War, which we are witnessing now, which Vladimir Putin unleashed against Ukraine.
Yep. So George Bush looked into Putin's eyes and saw a soul and thought that it was a beautiful soul. It's true. I remember covering that on the Young Turks back then. And he came up with a nickname for Putin, and I'm not joking. His nickname was Pooty Poot. Pooty Poot. It turns out he was not Pooty Poot. And so now I mentioned media because both of our speakers so far have mentioned first step is go after media. And today the head of Voice of America came out and said, what are we doing? He's shutting down Voice of America, which Trump is, which is supposed to help the people that are suffering under authoritarianism. It's supposed to be another source of information when all of the other media has been co-opted or shut down, etc. So, Ms. Hoja, I want to go to your expertise here, but there's now two things. One is the American side of it, but I just gave my opinion on that, which is, of course, it's terrible to shut down media. And why? Well, it's one thing to shut it down inside America. Why are you shutting it down, an outlet that's going to other countries that are living under authoritarian or totalitarian governments? It makes no sense unless, of course, that's what you're in favor of. But you also have the experience of covering China, which is much further down that road. So can you tell us about that experience?
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talking about the Uyghurs. And first thing I want to correct, I'm not the founder of the Radio Free Asia. I'm just an investigative journalist, has been working 24 years, 2 decades, in RFA Uyghur service. Right, I was a journalist in back home China, but as other authoritarianism, there's in China no media exists. It's only the pure propaganda tool. So I experienced when I worked for the state-run TV station in Xinjiang, which is in Uyghurs called East Turkestan, Uyghur region, main TV line. And slowly the Chinese government using even the children program. I was hosting a children program to brainwash our own kids and lie to the parents, to implement the idea, if you learn Chinese, give up your own culture, own everything, believe you're gonna have the bright future. So all those assimilation policy didn't work after Chinese government occupied our country, the Uyghur region, so-called Xinjiang. As the Xi Jinping final solution, they begin to genocide our people, Uyghur people, from the 2015. They first targeting actually the Uyghur writers, social media, influences, and other elites. And then as the only voice for the voiceless Uyghur people in America, which is funded by U.S. Congress, Radio Free Asia, Uyghur Service, me and my about 20 fellow journalists begin to expose the China's crime against humanity. For the Chinese government, of course, we all the journalists as criminals. Somehow I terrorized Xi Jinping. He labeled me as a terrorist in 2017 because of my reporting about the truth in the Uyghur region. And not only that, they target my entire family in back home. Also, putting them in the concentration camp and, to trying to silence me and my colleagues. Right now, as we know, about 56 innocent relatives of the Uyghur journalist has been taken to the concentration camp and disappeared. And we dispute on of all this unbearable pain. We still broadcasting and working, because if we don't talking about this genocide, this crime against humanity continuing in the Uyghur region, the world wouldn't know what the atrocity happening in the far west China. So today we are in a very confusing position, and still hoping the Trump administration can concern about our radio if you determined fund close up the Radio Free Asia. It will putting whole entire Uyghur region, maybe China, to the information black hole. So journalism is very important. As yesterday Maria Rosa mentioned, journalism is the tool of the democracy and the peace, because we find the truth, we exposing the crimes of all those atrocities who making mess in the world. So we're hoping we can exist and continue our very special job as a journalist to give only not the truth, the news to the whole world and the Uyghur people, also giving a light, giving, how can I say, the hope to our hopeless and voiceless people.
How many members of your family were arrested?
My total is 25. They first target my brother in 2017 to trying to shut me down. And I learned from my mom. My mom clearly says, if you want your brother alive, you have to stop. And they said the reason to them to take your brother is your work, is what you are doing. And after I didn't stop, actually I exposing more to the world about what Chinese government doing in the Uyghur region. Then they, in the one night in 2018, January 28, they took my family, all 24 people from the different cities. In one night, they gone. And somehow I learned that from some whistleblowers, my whole family arrested because of my work. And that day, I feel mentally I was died once. And then when I was thinking and about all those survivors, the information, the solid information gave us. And I fear, of course, about my family members will killed and tortured. But there's more people. There's millions of Uyghurs facing the same. So I feel my duty. So I was voice more. I was stood up to, in front of Congress. And then today my parents alive, thank God, because of the several lawmakers demand Chinese government, information about my family members. They released for 5 of my family members, but I am still doesn't know what happened to my dozen of cousins, aunts, and uncles.
Yeah. So my last name coincidentally happens to be Uyghur. I'm not an ethnic Uyghur, but I am Turkish. And so it's the last step in this totalitarian regime is they're now making the Uyghur men disappear, go into camps, and then marrying off the Uyghur women to Chinese husbands. So they erase the identity completely.
Yes.
So
Thank you for bringing this issue up. So many things still uncovered, by the main media, even today. There's, atrocity going on and genocide continues. It's a 21st century genocide recognized by US and other many parliaments as well. But the genocide still going on. This is the reality.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned today, the Uyghur woman facing forced marriage and the Uyghur children facing abduction, re-education in the very deep level. And also the scary things we find out is the organ harvesting also going on in the Uyghur region, Uyghur men and maybe even the children's in the children's camp, subjecting as the, organ harvesting.
Yeah.
So it's many issue needs to be covered, many issue to be in the spotlight.
Yep, exposed.
Exposed. Yes. But today, our issue is not in the main, news outlets because of many other atrocities happening around the world, unfortunately.
Yep. So now you've seen the whole range from starting from day 1 or day 3, right, to what happens at the very end. So Yavuz, your life changed in a day as well, or overnight. So tell us about that.
I will be brief, but when compared to Russia or China, Turkey may seem to be a relatively democratic country. Yes, relatively less autocratic country or less totalitarian, let's say, not more democratic. So just to give you an overview, let me summarize what happened in Turkey. Until 2016, there was a slide to authoritarianism in Turkey. And there were some institutions, including judiciary, to stand up against this, to preserve rule of law. But one of a sudden, on the night of 15 July 2016, there was a coup attempt. The authenticity of this coup attempt will be discussed later when we will have free media and when we will have access to all information freely. I will skip that part. But do you know how many people are being prosecuted? How many people have been put in prison for that coup attempt? There are currently more than 2 million people as suspects of anti-terror legislation in Turkey. 2 million people being involved in a coup attempt. And, I am one of them. And more than 150,000 public servants were purged in a few months under state of emergency laws. Among them are more than 4,000 judges and prosecutors. I am one of them. And I describe myself, my trajectory like this. I went to bed a judge and woke up a terrorist, like in the Kafka's Metamorphosis. So it was like this, and we didn't have the chance to defend ourselves. We didn't even have the chance to learn what we were being accused of. And following this rhetoric of blueprint or playbook, yes, my brother and his wife, who were both judge and prosecutor, they were arrested because of me. And it was said openly to them and to my father and my mother for many times. They said, bring Yavuz, take Oğuz. Oğuz is my brother. So he was tortured. He lost his mental health, and he was forced to give testimony, false testimony about me. And now that those testimonies are being used against me in the courts in Turkey. So, and I'm only a little tiny example of this. And why is this happening? Because we, with the European Judges Associations, took Erdogan government and his officials before the ICC, International Criminal Court. For what? For crimes against humanity. Turkey is not party state to Rome Statute. Turkey signed this, but not ratified. So for the crimes committed in Turkey, you cannot take Turkey before the ICC. What we did is we focused on the abductions from abroad. So those countries who are party states to Rome Statute, the abductions which took place in those countries, we just filed them and took it before the court in Den Haag. And now we have been targeted more and more. So that's why I had to move from Romania. Actually, I was a refugee in Romania for 2 years, and the Turkish government attempted to abduct me from Romania as well. So that's why I had to move to Belgium with my family. So I'm only a small example of this. Why I'm telling you this is that the situation in China, in Russia, is very well known because of this realpolitik, because of the international politics. Their situation is clear in the eyes of people. But when we are talking about rule of law, this rule of law concept is very much linked to international politics. The situation in Turkey is this bad. Turkey, according to Freedom House reports, is not free in the 9th year in a row. And Turkey is the only Council of Europe state against which there is this infringement procedure. And Turkey is the only Council of Europe state in the gray list of FATF. Turkey is the only Council of Europe country which is among the 4 worst countries when it comes to transnational repression, along with China, Russia, Egypt, and Turkey. So why you don't hear about these facts is that in terms of real politics, in terms of international politics, Turkey is needed to be positioned somewhere else. But these are the facts, my friends. So, and this is another issue. Maybe this can be a topic for another panel, the correlation between real politics and rule of law, and naming and shaming in terms of real politics, or limits of naming and shaming for this. So this is, in a nutshell, what I can say about Turkey. Thank you.
So we're running a little short on time, so I want to ask one more question generally to the panel. But I just want to jump in and say one more thing. You know, Vladimir talked about, hey, the West should take this more seriously, act quicker, right? Not call potential authoritarian leaders pooty-poot and keep encouraging and enabling them. So that's one thing that the West can do. We could also stop using one of the worst words in the English language, terrorism and terrorist. So you've been called a terrorist. You're a terrorist.
I'm vice president of an extremist organization.
Extremist. Yeah. Okay. Honestly, Israel and America came up with this.
What kind of a panel is this?
Right.
If you work a little bit harder, you can be a terrorist as well.
Yeah. No, I have not yet been called a terrorist by any government, but cross your fingers. But in public discourse, whenever I criticize Israel, I'm called a terrorist 1,000 times over, etc. So we've got to stop this nonsense where anyone who's opposed to a government or to a state is called terrorist over and over and over again. A country occupies people. They resist terrorists, right? Mm-hmm. An authoritarian leader takes over, that you resist terrorists. So we started this cancer of calling people against the government or against the state terrorists. So it's our obligation in the West to stop using this horrible word that makes no sense and greatly helps authoritarian leaders and governments. Okay, now, last thing is, we talked in the beginning about how do we stop it in the beginning. So they come for the media first, they come for the courts second, etc. Be mindful of that. Now that Russia is in the state that it is in, Hungary is, Turkey is, they're all in different stages. They're not in the same place. China, obviously, very advanced in being, as authoritarian and totalitarian as it can be. What can we do to reverse it now? I open that up to the whole panel, and that'll be our last.
Well, it's a difficult question. I think we reached a different stage, and I think it's more difficult to do it something in Russia, in Hungary, than probably in the United States, which is just at the beginning of everything, I think. So it's the right time to stop this further sliding into to the authoritarianism. As far as we have to make a different. We have to differentiate between the means between national means, using elections, trying to sanction the media, trying to use different channels to get to support the people, to disseminate ideas to the people. We have to use all the possibilities. We have to use international courts. I know, as a former member of the European Court of Human Rights, I know the limits of the power of the court. And of course, Russia left the European Court of Human Rights.
It was expelled.
Yes.
Right.
Hungary is still member of the European Court, the Convention, still member of the Convention, but it happens that Hungary doesn't implement the judgment of the Luxembourg Court. And the Hungary doesn't implement certain cases of the European Court of Human Rights. So it's not really effective, but we have to use all the possibilities. But in our countries, I don't know whether you agree with that, but in Hungary we have to strengthen all the oppositional forces fighting against the regime. In Hungary, at least, we very much hope that during the next coming elections, we are going to have a party which runs against the regime. And right now, according to the polls, it is 9% ahead of the ruling party. Whether this 9 percentage point is enough to win against such a media, such a 90% of the state media and all the money and all the resources. I don't know how they are going to cheat during the elections, how they are going to change the rules of the elections, because they have a constitutional majority. So we don't know. But we have to use all the possibilities and all the other countries which are just the beginning, beginning of this process, like the United States. It suddenly happened. But I think they have to support the courts. They have to support the independent media. They have to, and I very much hope that in the United States there will be a kind of contra movement against. I mean, economy is going down, stock exchange is going down. People start feeling that everything is getting more and more expensive because of the tariffs. And there is an international movement, of course, contra tariffs by Canada and Mexico and the EU, and it. So probably there will be a contra movement, economic, political, diplomatic movement against what's happening there, and probably it is still possible to stop this erosion. But in our countries, I think, well, we have to pick up every elements to fight against the regime, and probably others are. You have more to say on that.
Just a quick remark on what you talked about terrorism. That term has completely lost its real meaning, and I think the current regime in Russia is a very good example of how they're using it exactly in reverse. So, for example, Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, which committed unspeakable terror not only on the 7th of October 2023, but for years and years, they're not considered a terrorist organization by Putin's government. They're welcome in the Kremlin, they shake their hand, they embrace them in front of the cameras. That's okay, these are legitimate interlocutors. But we have writers, musicians, novelists, poets, and just public cultural figures who peacefully, in words, oppose the regime, and they're put on a terrorist list. So this word has completely lost its real meaning, and everything is completely reversed. On the substance of your question, I think it's really important that we have these comparative cases because everybody's at different stages. And Your Honor, I was a bit envious where you were saying a few minutes ago that, you have an election, there are opinion polls, there's an opposition party that's leading. All of these things you mentioned, we don't have. We have no elections, we have no opinions poll, we have no opposition parties because everything is being controlled. So needless to say, in our case, the Putin regime is not going to leave power by elections because we have no elections. And talking about sort of blueprints and rule books, if we reverse this and look at the ways that these regimes have been unseated from power, the regimes that where it's impossible to defeat them in a ballot box because we have no ballot boxes. We'll look at the way the Milosevic regime was overthrown in Serbia back in October of 2000, what happened in Ukraine with the Orange Revolution in 2004, in Georgia with the Rose Revolution in 2003, many other similar peaceful velvet, well, they're called revolutions, but they're actually just mass pro-democracy movements. All of them were peaceful. For example, in the Rose Revolution in Georgia 2003, or the Maidan, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine 2004, not a single window was broken. These were just hundreds of thousands of people standing in the middle of the capital city for the whole world to see. And it puts such a pressure on these dictatorial regimes that they cannot go on anymore. I think, frankly, that is the only way out of this dictatorship in Russia. I have no doubt that this dictatorship has no future because, we do live in the 21st century. And the future that belongs to my mind, to liberal democracies, to accountable constitutional government, not to these archaic one-man personalistic dictatorial regimes like Putin's or Erdogan's or Orban's. And the last thing I want to say is about the attitude of the free world, of the Western world. I do not know if this applies to other examples of authoritarian, totalitarian countries, but as I found out in these last 7 months that I've been out of prison, in the free world, in the Western world, there are two polar opposite narratives about Russia. Both of them, in my view, are completely wrong. One is the Trump-Orban narrative that Putin is great. Let's go back to business as usual. Let's just forget all the war crimes and the crimes against humanity he's unleashed, and let's just go back to dealing with him, buying oil and gas, looking into his eyes and all the rest of it. That's one polar extreme. And the other polar extreme, which I've sort of been shocked to listen to since I've been out of prison, is that, it's not just Putin. All these Russians are bad. They're all war criminals. They're all imperialists. They're all genetic slaves and all these other sort of bigoted insults that people are hurling out. This is unacceptable. So you talked about sanctions, Your Honor. I fully agree. And in fact, spent many years of my life working on advocating for Magnitsky laws, which are the laws introducing targeted personal, financial, and visa sanctions on these regime officials complicit in corruption and human rights abuses. Because that's one of the most effective tools the free world has. Because many of these authoritarian regimes, the people at the top of them, they want to steal from their own people, but then spend and stash that money in the West, right? It was just no secret for any of us. And so those types of sanctions against these types of regimes need to be expanded, strengthened, made sure that they work correctly. But I don't think it's okay to do what some of especially some countries on the eastern flank of the European Union have done, whereas they just impose complete blanket bans on anybody with a Russian passport, that people can't cross the border, can't drive their car, can't do this, can't do that. I don't think it's okay in the 21st century to discriminate against people just based on their nationality. Yeah. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, Your Honor, I think it's Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights that prohibits discrimination based on, among other things, national origin. So that's actually against the law. And so the last point, I think it's very important for democratic countries not to equate, not to put that equality sign between the citizens, the people who live in these dictatorships and who are actually the first ones to be oppressed by these dictatorships, and the dictatorships themselves. Because that is not only insulting and wrong, but that is also counterproductive, because the only way forward is for all of the countries that we're talking about, for all of our countries, to finally find a way to free ourselves from these regimes and to become normal, modern, constitutional democracies. I have no doubt it's going to happen in all of the cases represented in this panel.
Yeah. In this regard, when it comes to Turkey, what I can say, and it goes the same for Russia, I believe, Turkey is bigger than Erdogan, what I can say, of course, is this. And Russia is bigger than Putin, of course. And the answer to your question is yes, in addition to these Magnitsky sanctions and the ICC rulings, there is another way, which is something actually at a project phase. Some people in the United States, actually, Mark Wolf and some people from Harvard University, I'm not sure if Trump administration will cut their budget now, but they are trying to establish an international anti-corruption court. Mm-hmm. This would be really a key to solve these problems, because all these autocrats are corrupt. And remember how Al Capone was just caught. He was covering all his crimes, but the tax officers found a way, and he was just arrested. The same way, the same approach. So I think establishing such a court, because when it comes to Magnitsky sanctions, it has many things to do with diplomatic relations, because it's a diplomatic decision somehow to prosecute the leader of another country. But if there would be an international court with a central authority without need to get permission from any government, it could work. It's a dream for now, but maybe we should try to dream it a bit more. This might be the solution. And when it comes to Turkey again, you know, I have to criticize Committee of Ministers, because Turkey is the champion of the violations from the ECHR, European Court of Human Rights. But
it used to be Russian, and now that we're expelled,
yes,
you're number one.
Yes,
right.
After you quit, we are the champions now. And but that's the Committee of Ministers to follow the implementation of these decisions, but they are doing nothing. For Kavala, there's this infringement procedure for more than 2 years, and Committee of Ministers is doing nothing, I can say. So it's again about real politics, about geopolitics, because Committee of Ministers is the ministers, foreign affairs ministers of the Council of Europe member states. So they are deciding on what to do in case of such situations. Like if a member state doesn't implement the ECHR ruling, will we imply sanctions or not? So this is also diplomacy. So again, we are coming to the discussion between realpolitik and rule of law.
All right, we're way over time, but I'll end on the couple of notes that they said there. Same thing in America. I always tell people, don't hate Trump's voters. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't help. Our job is to reach out to them and to show them what we see. Also true of all these countries, Turkey, Russia, Hungary, etc. We love the people of those countries. We love those countries. And that is why we work so hard to free them and to make them freer societies. Thank you so much to all the panelists. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you for coming.